Since first landing on the shores of America in 1619, African Americans have faced inhumane treatment at the hands of Caucasians. They were segregated, enslaved, and treated as second-class citizens. However, beginning in 1865 with the passing of the 13th Amendment that ended slavery, African Americans began to stand up for their unalienable rights. Before attracting national attention, the Civil Rights Movement focused on gaining political and social rights for African Americans in the southern states. But beginning in 1954, with the victory in Brown v. Board of Education, the Civil Rights Movement began to gain ground and attract extensive support from not only the public but Caucasian politicians.
Influential leaders of the Civil Rights Movement utilized nonviolent approaches to bring awareness to political and social injustices. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., arguably one of the most powerful civil rights leaders in the Civil Rights Movement, advocated for a nonviolent approach to counteract the partisan agendas of the state and federal government. He gained substantial ground when President Dwight Eisenhower signed the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which protected African Americans' right to vote. However, the younger generation of Americans were not being given equal education opportunities, thus preventing African Americans from obtaining a higher education and further bettering their quality of life.
Because of the legal doctrine of separate but equal, African Americans were excluded from obtaining a higher education at institutions that were majority Caucasian, thus prompting the creation of HBCUs, or historically black colleges and universities, that catered to the African American population. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was instrumental in the struggle to achieve equality on the education front. The NAACP provided legal assistance to cases that involved partisanship and prejudices against African Americans that applied to majority Caucasian institutions.
The integration of the University of Mississippi by James Meredith attracted national attention and sparked the conversation for whether educational institutions should be desegregated. The South during this time period was permeated with Jim Crow, which was a collection of state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation. Jim Crow was based on the theory of white supremacy and was relentless in suppressing blacks. But James Meredith's parents constantly instilled into him that life was going to be onerous for a colored boy in Casuco, Mississippi.
Meredith's first institutionalized racist encounter was when he was riding a train from Chicago with his brother. He was ordered to give up his seat for a white woman and head to the back of the bus. This subconsciously instilled a sense of apprehension for the society he was living in. After high school, Meredith spent 9 years in the United States Air Force before enrolling in Jackson State College, an HBCU in Mississippi. In 1961, an empowered James Meredith applied to the University of Mississippi and was initially accepted, but then denied twice because of their previous policies of only admitting white students. Meredith recognized the disparities that were occurring and wrote to the admissions office, in which he formulated a well-constructed letter detailing his emotions and how a degree from such a distinguished university would speak volumes for the black community.
After repeated denial, Meredith sought the backing of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund and filed suit in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Mississippi. The case went through many hearings, after which the United States Court of Appeals ruled that Meredith had the right to be admitted into the school. The openly discriminatory governor of Mississippi, Ross Barnett, and the state legislature passed a law that denied admission to anyone who was convicted of a felony or felony offenses. Subsequently, after they charged Meredith with false voter registration in the county of Jackson, but later the clerk declared Meredith was allowed to vote in Jackson, Mississippi, thus keeping his ambitions alive at attaining his degree. The U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy covertly made a deal with Governor Barnett to permit Meredith to enroll in the university, but the process of getting on campus would prove to be substantially more laborious than the enrollment.
If this country should ever reach the point where any man or group of men, by force or threat of force, could long deny the commands of our court and our Constitution, then no law would stand free from doubt. No judge would be sure of his writ, and no citizen would be safe from his neighbors.
Methodical and orderly were words expected to be displayed when getting Meredith to campus, especially with the extensive militia and armed forces that were ordered by President Kennedy. But the experience could be undoubtedly characterized as intense, turbulent, and even callous. On the evening of September 29th, after State Senator George Yarborough withdrew the state highway police, a riot broke out the following day. Whites opposing integration had been gathering at the campus ready to protest Meredith's enrollment. Despite the Kennedy administration's reluctance to use force, it ordered the nationalized Mississippi National Guard and federal troops to the campus. As a result of the pandemonium, 2 men were killed by gun violence, White mobs burned cars, vandalized school property, and attacked the militia with rocks and bricks.
After the tumultuous and grueling admission process, his time earning a degree would prove even more difficult. Students harassed Meredith on campus, calling him racial slurs and blatantly ostracized him, excluding him from class and even during lunch. White students would even bounce basketballs on the floor above his room to divert him away from his studies. Meredith valiantly persevered through all of these adversities and earned a degree in law and politics. His endeavors encouraged a second black student, Cleve McDowell, to enroll in the university, and eventually a man named Cleveland Donald Jr. graduated with a history degree in 1966 and used the degree to establish a highly acclaimed African American studies program.
Not so much that he was exposed daily to danger because he had a military guard by him, but he was shunned by much of the student body who would have nothing to do with him. If he went into a classroom, sometimes students would get up and leave the classroom rather than sit in the room with him.
Wow.
I think he usually dined alone at the cafeteria. I know that when I first met with him and talked with him years ago, I told him I feel very badly that I had not gone and at least had a cup of coffee with him or had a meal with him to make it easy.
The short-term impact of Meredith's integration into University of Mississippi led to the attendance of other black students at that university and others in the South. Eventually, the University of Alabama was fully integrated in 1963 when John F. Kennedy sent National Guard troops and deployed them to the university to force its desegregation. In 1966, Meredith engaged in a peaceful solo march across the South to encourage black voters. The march was later entitled the March Against Fear. Unfortunately, he was shot and wounded by an unemployed white hardware clerk by the name of Aubrey Norville. Norville shot Meredith 3 times, all in the torso. Luckily, none of the bullets hit any vital organs, and Meredith was able to make a successful recovery. Norville was found and arrested later that day, and 50 civil rights leaders decided to continue the March Against Fear in Meredith's name. After recovery, Meredith then went on to receive a master's degree in economics from the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, as well as a law degree from the University of Columbia.
The long-term impact of Meredith's accomplishments had an astounding effect on the civil rights movement and how African Americans were perceived on a national platform. His attendance and graduation from Mississippi University was a catalyst for other young African Americans to begin to pursue their higher education degrees. Meredith was seen as a significant figure in the civil rights movement, and a large part of the reason that many Southern universities were integrated. In 2006, the University of Mississippi unveiled a statue of Meredith placed at the circle of the iconic Lysa Museum. However, until recently, Meredith opposed the building of this statue and advocated for its removal, along with numerous other Confederate flag statues.
When I was an orientation leader, I, of course, probably would not have known this, so a lot of people don't know this about his statue, but the university, and of course it makes me mad and many other people mad, but they actually changed his words on that statue. So there's a statue of him that you've probably seen a picture of, and then there's like an arch, and inside that arch are quotes from things he said, and they changed the wording around to make it sound a little fluffier and nicer, when in reality those are not the words he said, because that was not a good time.
Overall, James Meredith's contribution to the civil rights movement was unparalleled. The courage he displayed to be the first African-American student to integrate a white Southern institution, as well as the bravery he exhibited in his March Against Fear in 1966. His advocacy of higher education created a sense of nationalism and unity among other young black students, and the concept of black power became posterized. Later in his life, his political career made a difference in the lives of other Southern blacks and eventually helped implement an African American Studies program in universities all around the country.